Thank you, and welcome Ambassador Danny Danon. We're excited and thrilled to have you as our special guest for the next hour. We're looking forward to hearing from you the story about the United Nations, and that takes in a lot of territory. By way of brief introduction, and because you've had an illustrious career at a relatively young age already, I'll simply start by saying you joined the Knesset as part of the Likud party in 2009, where you stayed until 2015. During that time, you were the Minister of Science, Technology, and Space, and the Deputy Minister of Defense, as well as the Deputy Speaker. At that point, you were appointed as the 17th permanent representative to the United Nations, where you were from 2015 to 2020. During an interesting time, you saw President Obama and President Trump. But I'm going to ask you, and we're going to start right away talking about the United Nations today and how Israel is perceived. And I'm going to start by quoting the legendary Israeli diplomat, Abba Eban, who died almost 20 years ago, but decades ago said this. I'll quote what he says. If Algeria introduced a resolution declaring that the earth was flat and that Israel had flattened it, it would pass by a vote of 164 to 13 with 26 abstentions. Is that still true today?
Thank you very much, Jonas, for having me. And yes, unfortunately, the numbers of Abba Eban are still correct. You know, when you look at the numbers today at the UN, you have 193 member states. And unfortunately, when you face a resolution condemning Israel, and I faced many of those through the 5 years I served at the UN, the numbers were around that. But I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because we are starting to see the change. We are starting to convince countries to actually read the resolutions before they vote about them. And we were able to see a few, even I would say, victories at the UN, including in the General Assembly. I will give you two examples. One victory was when, together with Ambassador Haley, we decided to put a resolution condemning Hamas. We couldn't get the plurality because you need majority vote. You need 2/3 for that. We couldn't get 2/3 in the General Assembly, but we got the plurality votes. And that was amazing that most of the ambassadors in the room voted with us to condemn Hamas. So for us, it was a victory. Some would say, yeah, but it didn't pass. So I think, you know, you have to work slowly and gradually. You can change the UN. The second example is I think, in the moment where I am the most proud of at the UN. People speak about disappointments, but we have to speak also about achievements. And that was when I decided to run for the position of the chairman of the legal committee of the UN. It was the first time that Israel actually ran for a position chairing one of the 6 committees. And I worked really hard. I met all of the ambassadors I could meet. I got the support, and it was secret ballots, so it was different. But the numbers count. We got the support of 109 member states who voted for me, and only 44 voted against me. And I became the first Israeli ever to chair a UN committee. So I think if you want to conclude this part, we have to realize and understand that when it comes to public votes, we cannot get a majority for any resolution yet. But when it comes to secret ballots, where people can actually feel and vote the same way, we can get a lot of support, and we can actually, I would say, we can dare more when it comes to those votes.
So maybe you can explain what determines if a vote is secret or if a vote is public, because it sounds like if we could have all secret votes, things may change a lot.
Absolutely. So first of all, votes that concern any personal elections for positions are secret. And I took advantage of that when I went for the 6th committee, for the legal committee. And also one of the things that which I discussed in the book that will be published in May was my disappointment that we didn't run for a seat on the Security Council. For me, it was a big achievement. And I convinced the Prime Minister that we should run because it's secret ballots. And even if we lose, it's a victory. But unfortunately, the diplomats in the ministry in Jerusalem convince the prime minister that we don't have the budget and the energy to run a successful campaign, and we had to drop out at the early stage of the campaign, which for me was a big disappointment. And I think it was a grave mistake for the Israeli foreign ministry. So you cannot choose when you get secret ballots, but you can identify the opportunities, usually when you have personal candidates and that you can present to different positions.
So, and Canada knows something about campaigning to be on the Security Council too. So we maybe share that on success. But I'd like to come back a little bit to a member or a country that would vote against Israel in a public vote, that would vote that would vote for something that favored Israel privately. How does that happen? Because it's not that ambassador accountable to his government that might be anti-Israeli, or is that personal relationship? Or maybe tell us what goes on behind the scenes. Who do you speak to, and what's the nature of that conversation? Is there a quid pro quo? You vote for me on this, I'll vote for you on that. How does that come about to engage success at the United Nations and a private ballot?
So it's a combination of all the things you just mentioned. First of all, I learned that the smaller the country is, the more important the ambassador is. And that might sound weird to you, Jonas, but actually the small countries, the ambassador, he has no one to call. There is no back office or a capital that he will call for instructions. Sometimes he will tell me, Danny, nobody understands what are the issues in my capital. We have a tiny Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I learned that those tiny nations are crucial, because if you get the ambassador, you convince him, you got the vote. Second part is many of the countries bilaterally, they have very strong relations with Israel. Look at the map today. We have diplomatic relations with more than 165 countries. So why, when it comes to the multilateral arena, to the UN, they vote against us? Usually it's because I call it the gang mentality. They will tell me, Danny, we love Israel, we support you, but we belong to this group or that group, the African Union, the Arab League, the Latin American group, you name it. And then within the group, the anti-Israel forces and voices are louder and more influential. But when it comes to secret ballots, they can actually decide with their own government about how to support Israel. And that's where we see the success. And if I go back to the resolution I mentioned about me getting elected, so before the meeting, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries, which includes 56 nations, they had a special meeting, and they decided to vote against me. But you saw what happened a year later, an hour after the meeting, only 44 voted against me. So you can analyze the votes. And also today, within the Arab League, we work with many moderate Arab countries, and they were very happy when I won that vote.
Well, speaking of, let me come to, that's the good side, and you've talked about you've got to stay positive. But in the public votes, I think the statistics are something like this. Last year, 2021, the General Assembly passed 14 anti-Israeli resolutions and 4 against other countries. So we're in the company of North Korea, Iran, Myanmar, and Russia. 14-4, which is about 75%. In 2020, that was consistent. It was 17-6. And I think in a period of time, between 75 and 80% of the resolutions condemning countries are focused at Israel. Why? And we talk about small countries. So what is it that preoccupies the United Nations, even though there are these glimmers of light, as you say, but when it comes to raising your hand in a public vote, what is it that, why is Israel preoccupying the United Nations? And we'll go back in time in a moment or so to see if it always was that way, but certainly today, and we'll come to Human Rights Council and what's going on there, but generally in these General Assembly resolutions, what's going on?
Well, you cannot argue with the numbers you mentioned, Jonas. I call it diplomatic terrorism. When you see the amount and the language being used against Israel, it has no connection to the reality. When you speak about human rights violations, You cannot ignore what's happening in Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, and blame Israel. I think the main reason starts with the rejectionism of the Palestinian leadership. When you go back to 1947, to the partition plan that decided to establish a Jewish state and an Arab state, not a Palestinian state. Back then, the Palestinians said, no, you don't accept it. And since then, any offer that was on the table, they rejected. Now, what they can do in order to justify their rejection, they had to initiate resolutions against Israel. And starting mainly in the 70s, there was a campaign of resolutions condemning Israel. One of them in 1975, the shameful resolution equating Zionism to racism. But many of those resolutions are still there. And that's something that we have to realize, that at the UN, every year you vote on the same resolutions. When I came in, I was shocked. I came from the Knesset, from the parliament, and like every other parliament in the world, once you pass a bill or a piece of legislation, you move on. That's not the case at the UN. Every General Assembly, you will take the same resolutions you adopted last year and you will bring them back to the table. So unfortunately, when it comes to Israel, they take all those old resolutions and bring them back to life. Some of them are not relevant anymore. I always use the example of a resolution that Lebanon initiated against Israel decades ago regarding, they blame us for creating an oil spill in the Mediterranean. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it happened decades ago. But still, they will bring the same resolution to the General Assembly, and it will pass with majority votes condemning Israel. So it shows that the relevancy of the UN, unfortunately, is not dealing with what really are the core issues today in the Middle East or worldwide.
Hillel Neuer, familiar to this group from UN Watch, says, make no mistake, the purpose of these lopsided resolutions and the condemnation is to demonize the Jewish state. That's what he says. He talks about the UN's automatic majority has no interest in helping Palestinians. So this automatic majority, I suppose is what you're saying, is this group that just knee-jerk reaction, anything anti-Israel, anything pro-Palestinian is going to get passed. But why is there, so demonizing Israel has been the history of the Jewish people for 3,000 years. Why is there no effort to, is he right when he says there's no real interest in helping the Palestinians?
Well, I think today, when you look at the outcome of those resolutions, we can agree that they are not helping the Palestinian cause. On the contrary, it gives them empty victories. So maybe they get few headlines for a day or two, and then what? And I remember when I stood by myself in the Security Council when President Obama promoted Resolution 2334, a few days before he left office. And I asked the American ambassador and my colleagues, what do you think will happen next week? What will happen in a month? What you are doing today, you are actually discouraging the Palestinians from negotiating with us. Because when you look at the peace treaty that we signed with Egypt and Jordan, and now we can say about the UAE and other countries, we did it directly with them. But when you come to the General Assembly, to the Security Council, you pass empty resolutions. I call them feel-good resolutions. So maybe the Palestinians feel good, the leadership for a day, but the Palestinian people, they don't get anything, they don't move forward. And that's, I think, they are not only they're not helping them, they're actually hurting their cause.
Let's go. I'm interested in the preparation you do when you get appointed. Someone knocks on your door and says, Danny, we'd like you to go over there and be our representative. And I think what happened, the run up to this is interesting. You were appointed Minister of Defense in Netanyahu's government. And I think we have a nice picture of you and Bibi Netanyahu. There we are. I guess that's the Likud outfit you're wearing together. And then you criticize Netanyahu for signing an agreement with Hamas to end a conflict earlier. And then the next thing, you were moved over to the United Nations. Now, a cynical journalist at Haaretz at the time, in an article, said 6 reasons to worry about Israel's new ambassador, Danny Danon, thought that he was accomplishing 2 things. He was moving you out of being a thorn in his side and putting you in the United Nations where you could do some real good. You walked in, and I think your first meeting at the Security Council, breaching protocol, the Palestinian representative kept interrupting you. Riyad Mansour kept interrupting you several times to try to rattle you, let's say, and you kept your composure. How do you deal with that, and how are you prepared for that? And what did you learn from your first days at the United Nations?
Well, first, to set the record straight, it's true. I was Deputy Minister of Defense when I criticized Prime Minister Netanyahu, but that was a year before my appointment. And I have known to be one who is very direct in his policy, in his politics. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, he actually appreciated that. He knew that if I had the courage to stand against him as the Prime Minister when I thought he was wrong, he knew that I would do the same at the UN. He served as the ambassador, and he knew how tough the battlefield of the UN is. And when I got the offer from him, first I had to speak with my wife, because it's not a personal decision. You have to relocate your family. My wife grew up in Canada, so for her it was easier, but for my kids, it was a challenge. And when I came in, I decided to work hard. And you quoted one cynical reporter. I can give you dozens. And I would say that I proved them wrong. And I am very proud of that, because I proved them that you can actually build bridges. And I proved that in 5 years, you can accomplish a lot, even in a hostile place like the UN. But you don't have to appease everybody all the time. It is okay to be direct. It is okay to, you mentioned Mr. Mansour. So I exposed his lies every week when he actually spoke against the IDF or the state of Israel. I wouldn't say, no, it's not true. I would actually get back to the ambassador with the facts, and I will answer every allegation against Israel. So people actually realize that when I speak, I checked my facts, and I can stand behind what I said. And that's how I gained the respect for my colleagues.
Well, you didn't hold back, that's for sure. And you actually, and I'm going to say you are an author. I should have said that at the start. You are an author. You've written, to my knowledge, 2 books. One in 10 years ago, Israel, The Will to Prevail. And I think we have a slide of it, which is a wonderful book. You were then speaker. And now you've written another book called In the Lion's Den, which I was not on the pre-distribution VIP lists, so I didn't read it.
We haven't sent any books yet, so you will be.
So I'll point out that In the Lion's Den will be published. I will read it. It looks great. I'm assuming, and this presumably picks up that last 10-year period and presumably deals with the time at the UN principally. And the foreword is by nobody less than Nikki Haley. And the endorsements I saw include Senator Joseph Lieberman, as well as many other notables. So you're off to a great start, and that's a book we look forward to seeing. I'm assuming that the reference to Lion's Den is the biblical story Daniel in the Lion's Den.
Indeed, and many times I felt that I'm actually in the Lion's Den by myself, having to stand strong actually, I didn't know, but because I assumed I was in a very important position of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I had to get many permits to publish this book. So it took me a while to get permits from the different ministries and authorities in Israel, approving every line and every sentence. And it will be very interesting to reveal the behind the scenes of the 5 years I served there. But I think that you will find out that the stories are very interesting. There are some surprises in the book, but the approach is what counts. And my approach was to be proud in my Judaism. I put the yarmulke, I read from the Bible. I never actually hid my Judaism. And that was something unique for international diplomacy. The second part was to use our technology and innovation. As the Minister of Science and Technology, I brought a lot of my friends to the UN to show the know-how to the UN itself and to the different ambassadors. And the third part is actually bring the UN to Israel. So I brought with me more than 100 UN ambassadors over the years to get to know Israel. And that was an amazing experience. Even Ambassador Haley, the first visit she came with me was her first time in Israel. And once you come and you meet the people, you see the challenges, you see the threats from Lebanon of Hezbollah and Hamas in Gaza, you get it. And that's why I think it's very important to continue to bring leaders and potential leaders, to bring them to Israel to learn for themselves.
I want to come back to that because that's a deeper topic. And I want to talk about your relationship with Samantha Powers as well as Nikki Haley at the same time. But you do say in your book, I represent a new generation of leaders who see Israel taking a different and more autonomous path than it has over several decades. And you were forthright. Now, we have a slide of one poster. I think this is 2015. You're just a rookie at the UN, and you have a slide of how to stab a Jew. So you can't be more direct than that. Can you tell us what's behind that and what was going on at that moment and what you were trying to accomplish with that?
That was the early days at the UN, and unfortunately, when I walked in to the position, there was a wave of violence in the streets of Israel. Young Palestinians would actually stab innocent Israelis, and I always said it. You know, Nelson Mandela once wrote that you are not born with hate. Somebody is teaching you to hate, and I focused on the Palestinian incitement. What they are teaching the kids in school, what they are showing them in the Palestinian television. And I proved my case. And I said, listen, we can argue about a lot of things, but we cannot allow the Palestinians to continue with the education of hate and the propaganda against Jews. So in this scenario, I actually showed them textbooks of the Palestinians and content that you can find in the internet, actually telling Palestinian children how to stab a Jew, which knife to use, and how to be effective.
Of course, these are the stories that at Honest Reporting, it's reporting by omission. It's what the media doesn't cover that's the most insidious and hateful, and the lack of coverage of some of these things. And we'll come to these things a little bit later in this hour. I do want to go back for a moment to 1947, and you already referenced this, to talk about really the starting point, because this takes us into, you've spoken about annexation and occupation, which is the topic that permeates a lot of the United Nations, a lot of the social media, the West Bank, Samaria, Judea. And I want to go back to Resolution 181, which is in November of 1947. It predates the declaration of the State of Israel, of course, as you mentioned. And that really is what picks up from the British mandate and creates the two-state solution rejected by the Arab countries. And interestingly enough, picks up the language from the Balfour Declaration of creating a homeland for the Jewish people. And itself refers to that homeland and references Samaria and Judea. And that was a moment in time where the United Nations was a very different United Nations in some ways. In your book, Israel, The Will to Prevail, you point out that was not an easy thing. There's a lot of behind the scenes things in 1948. But is that there was a sentiment then that's clearly changed. And I'd like you to take us a little bit through 1948 to 1967, particularly as it relates to Judea and Samaria, and get into this conversation about occupation versus annexation. And you know, are we annexing our own land, or was this really Palestinian lands? Because there's a lot of confusion, I think, maybe intentional by the media, in the media. So can you unpack a little bit the West Bank and Samaria and Judea and this vocabulary that we seem to be using of Judea, Samaria, and you've spoken much about this, and I think maybe there's not agreement inside the Israeli government, certainly maybe not inside Likud itself. And I should mention today that in the introduction I did not, that today you are chairman of the international chairman of the Likud party, if I've got that title correct. That's right. So just to put all the cards on the table here.
Well, so you said it correctly that back then to get the votes was fascinating. In 2017, I initiated an event about the reenactment of the vote that took place in the Queen's Museum. Actually, the vote was not in the UN building because the UN back then was meeting in a Flushing Meadow in Queens, and we actually hired the same location, and we held the reenactment. And when I spoke with each ambassador of the country that supported us, the 33 countries that voted yes, there's a huge story behind it. Whether it was the doctor of the president or the friend of the wife of somebody they knew, and that's fascinating to hear those stories. And today, when I travel to different countries in the world, I thank those countries who stood with us back then, and I tell them that we are grateful for what they did. It was a different UN. There were a little bit more than 50 nations. Today, you have almost 200 nations. And I'm not sure what would have been the result of the vote today, at the UN of today. It's much more complicated. Back then, it was right after the Second World War, and there was a lot of sympathy for the Zionist dream, and we took advantage of that. And I have to give credit to our leaders. I grew up as somebody who admired Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin, and not David Ben-Gurion and the labor leaders, but I have to give credit to David Ben-Gurion. He wasn't happy with the UN. He wasn't happy with the resolution. He wasn't happy with the international approach to Jerusalem, but he realized that you have to be pragmatic. You have to take what you can get now and move forward. And that's what he did. He accepted the plan. He declared the independence in Rothschild Street, and he started to build the nation. And, I took my children to his house in Sde Boker in the Negev a few weeks ago. And it's very nice to visit a small museum. You see where he lived in the kibbutz and his desk. And one thing is amazing. He has like a small to-do list, what he has to do after the vote of the UN. And that's amazing. He said, we have to build the military, decide about the parliament, huge decisions. When I do my to-do list, Jonas, so you do yours, we have to take care of something in the bank or to submit something. And here you see David Ben-Gurion is actually forming, by himself, the future of the nation. So I do give him a lot of credit for the leadership he showed back then and putting the pillars for the future country, for the future state. And it happened also, until 1967. We built the nation. In 67, unfortunately, there was another war, but we defended our borders. And no one actually is saying that it was our intention to start that war. And one thing I want to make clear when you look at the dates, the PLO was established in 1964. The Six-Day War was 1967. So when you ask someone about the Palestinian Liberalization Organization, which was established in 1964, so we should ask what exactly they wanted to liberate. So it wasn't to liberate Judea and Samaria, because back then Judea and Samaria was not under the control of Israel. So I think it proves that the conflict is not about this Jewish community or another one. It's about the presence of Jews in the region, period. And it was proved again in 2005 when Prime Minister Sharon decided to evacuate thousands of Jews from Gaza, from the Gaza Strip. And nobody actually appreciated that. And you see what happened with Hamas. And still we are being blamed for so-called occupying Gaza. So I think we have to understand that when we speak about recognition of the state of Israel, it's about recognition of Jews in the area. Some would say Tel Aviv, some would say Jerusalem, some would say communities in Judea and Samaria. But at large, it's not about dispute about territory. it's dispute about recognition.
Well, it's remarkable, as you say, about Ben Gurion. I think it was Ben Gurion who said that in Israel, if you don't believe in miracles, you're not a realist. And that to-do list couldn't be a better example of that. There certainly would have been sympathy for the Jewish state in 1948 coming out of the war, the Holocaust. But at the same time, in December 1949, I want to speak for a moment about UNRWA, this United Nations Relief and Works Agency. There was a resolution to create this temporary group to deal with the approximate numbers vary. I've seen as low as 400. I've seen as high as 750,000 Palestinians. Let's call them Palestinians who were the Arab community inside Israel who left because of the war in 1948. There is no mention of the equal number of Jews who were expelled from Arab countries, Algeria, Libya, etc. The list goes on. Equal number. There's no UN organization that deals with them. They're forgotten. There is no such thing as a right to return or discussion of right to return. And in fact, the number is fixed at 750, whereas the Palestinian refugee issue, I think the United Nations changed the definition uniquely, the only time in history, before or since, where a refugee includes a descendant, a living descendant. So this population has grown, has been perpetuated, and no Arab country has wanted to deal with it. I think you would agree, especially Jordan, perhaps Syria. Maybe you could speak about that. Because that's part of the United Nations ecosystem, UNRWA, and it's something that festers hatred towards the Jewish population in the state of Israel.
So, when I served at the UN, Jonas, every year, we marked the issue of the forgotten Jewish refugees, because I think it's important. It's important to speak about it. It's important to bring it up. We don't expect to get compensations from the Arab governments. And I told it to my Arab colleagues. But it's important for history that it will be marked exactly what happened. When my father's family fled Egypt, Alexandria, Egypt, in 1950, they left everything behind. So nobody is coming and asking the Egyptian government now to pay compensation, but at least it should be recognized. And I think it's a claim we shouldn't abandon. We have to speak about it and make sure it will be brought up in future discussions as well. Regarding UNRWA, that's unfortunate. And that's a great example when there is an idea of the UN and people are not willing to reconsider it. And I had many discussions with the ambassador of Canada, the EU, regarding support for UNRWA. And I told him, listen, we have nothing against humanitarian support for the Palestinians. On the contrary, but make sure that the funds you are giving are not being used for terrorism and for incitement. And second, when you invest in something for 20, 30 years, you expect to see results. So ask tough questions about what are the results. And you cannot see the results. Instead of teaching the Palestinians, giving them the proper education, UNRWA did exactly the opposite. And I'm sure if those refugees, so-called refugees, were treated by the UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees of the UN, I'm sure by now they were in a much better position in terms of education, profession, housing. That's not the case with UNRWA. They want to leave the Palestinians where they are in order to continue to receive more funding, to have more positions, and that's not helping the Palestinians.
After 1967, the UN resolution, there's only two historical ones, I think, to deal with that are really important, this and one other. 242 is the so-called land for peace with kind of not precise language. It said that Israel has a right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats of force. It also called for Israel to withdraw from territories occupied. And a lot has been made of the lack of a definite article. It's not the territories, is it some territories? So people make interpretations of what this means, but the basic concept is land for peace. And that gets quoted a lot. As you point out, it was tried in Gaza unsuccessfully, bad experiment in 2005. I believe you opposed that withdrawal at the time. And now, of course, it's one political group in Gaza, Hamas, and a different political group, sort of, with Mahmoud Abbas. And I wanted just to look at a little bit of that war changes the character of what Israel is and how Israel is perceived to the world. I think if there's a point in time where David and Goliath get reversed, that's the moment in time where the start of the Israeli so-called oppression and racism and the words that get used start. It is the idea of handing back some of West Bank or Judea and Samaria, part of the territories that were carved out in Oslo and so forth. Does that have a future, or is that something that time has come and gone?
So before answering your question, I would say that despite the hardship that you have in honest reporting, dealing with the criticism and the hate against Israel, and what we have to do also at the UN and worldwide, I prefer the situation where we are today, where we are strong, independent, and we have borders we can protect our people, rather than be in a place where we actually beg for mercy from the international community. When you look at what's happening today all around the world, and then we can, we don't need to mention countries today where you have tensions. At the end of the day, each country has to take care of the security of its citizens. So I think today we are blessed to be where we are, that we have a strong independent country with a strong independent military that is capable of protecting our country. Now, getting back to the political issue, I will try to look at it from above. You know my background, my ideology, but I think when you look at it from above, you understand that the Israelis are willing to make compromise if they identify a viable partner. Because twice we actually made concessions. Once was with Egypt, major concession over Sinai, and Menachem Begin from Likud was the leader who initiated it, and it was well received by majority of Israelis. The second time when Sharon did it, also it was in Likud, but he left, and it was not well received by everybody. A lot of criticism, including myself, and you look what happened today. So I think the Israelis today will actually, before they will argue about whether it belongs to us or whether we need it for security or not, they will look at the partner, and they will try to identify if there is a strong partner or not. And that's what we cannot see today, any viable partner among the Palestinians. Look what's happening with the UAE. I was very involved in behind the scenes before we signed the agreement, and today you have a strong bond between the people, between the leadership, and that's something we are very proud of. So I think today it's more about Abu Mazen is 87. He will not sign any deal with Israel. The question is who will take his place, what will be the approach, and if the Israelis will actually identify a partner, then you can start the argument. But today, when you look at the political map in Israel, or you listen to the discussions in the Knesset, you don't have the discussion of land for peace anymore. It's not part of the campaign. When I was a child, it was in every campaign that was land for peace. We argued about it for years. It's not an argument anymore, because today there is an acceptance from both left to right that there is no real partner among the Palestinians.
Let's just break that down a little bit. So when we say the Palestinians, I think of three constituencies you have to think of. You have Hamas in Gaza, which would be the most extreme, and I think are publicly committed to the destruction of the state of Israel. It's straightforward. And I think that you're saying there, and you've said, the first thing to do is have a partner for peace, and it's not the existing regime. So how does that change? Well, the other thing I'll point out in Fatah in the West Bank or Samaria and Judea, you have Abu Mazen, but had he had the elections, and maybe people on this program have heard that maybe he used Sheikh Jarrah and other reasons to postpone and not have elections for a long, long time because he feels he will lose the way he lost Gaza. So the partner may get worse, in fact, before it gets better, if it gets better at some point, we stay optimistic. And then you also have the Palestinian Israeli citizen population of roughly 20% of the population in Israel, just over 2 million people. And we did see a few things that were nice to see in the May war, when you did have some problems I don't think we've seen before in that way, where the Arab population in Israel, the Israeli citizens, or Arab citizens, had conflict with the Jewish population and limited local settings, but nonetheless they existed. So in the case of each of those three, how do you see going forward in the best way possible?
So I think the most challenging is the situation in Gaza, because over there you have occupation, not of Israel, occupation of Hamas over the poor Palestinians. And by the way, when we are being accused of occupying Gaza, and I prove my colleague that it's not the case, and then they tell me, no, you are not allowing certain merchandise to enter Gaza. And my response is, there is a border between Gaza and Egypt. You have no presence of Israelis on that border. Why, when you criticize us, you don't criticize Egypt at the same time? So today we really don't have any influence on the future of Gaza. And the people who suffer the most are the Palestinians in Gaza. And that's something which in the near future, it's very hard to see any change there, which is unfortunate. And they suffer the most. When you look at the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, the situation is much, much better. But still, there's a lot of corruption, lack of governance. I hope that in the days after President Abbas, a leader will emerge that will care more about education, infrastructure, rather than coming to the UN and speak against Israel. That will be very important. And regarding the Arab Israelis, that's a point of concern, because what we saw last May was unacceptable. Yes, you have gaps, and yes, we have to invest more. And by the way, not only in the Arab sector, but also the ultra-Orthodox. You have huge gaps, and the poorest people in Israel today are Arab Israelis and the ultra-Orthodox. But you cannot accept or expect violence the way we saw, and that's something we have to deal with, and we shouldn't hide the problem. It is there, it's a problem. We should not label the entire population, but we should deal with the radicals, with those who incite the population against us.
I want to talk about the Abraham Accord for a moment, because we now have, and I think we've got the flags of the countries that are part of that accord, and you were instrumental in the early days for sure of breaking new territory. And when you see those 4 flags from Arab countries, and you add into it a peace treaty with Jordan and a peace treaty with Egypt, you take that down. This conflict that used to be called, or has been called, the Israeli-Arab conflict, really is an outdated term when you look at those alliances, and maybe the correct reference is the Israeli-Hamas conflict, because even it's not a warm relationship, it's a cool relationship, but it's a relationship with Mahmoud Abbas, or even broader, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But is it inappropriate to talk about an Arab-Israeli conflict anymore?
Well, I think it's very interesting. And I remember I had a debate with Secretary Kerry where he gave interviews and I responded. And he always claimed that there will be no peace with any Arab states until we solve the conflict with the Palestinians. And I said it is exactly the opposite. The paradigm changed completely. We will only be able to actually have a sincere dialogue with the Palestinians once we will have more moderate Arab countries recognizing Israel. And I'm happy that it's happening now. I think that's the way to move forward. And that's what I hear also in different capitals in the region, that they are interested, they are willing to recognize Israel, to build bridges, and eventually to help the negotiations with the Palestinians. And I think it's important. A number counts. When you look at the UN, for example, even when you look at the Arab League, number counts. So if I used to work quietly with 4 or 5 countries within the Arab League, today, you can get more countries, and you can even speak about majority of Arab countries that actually recognize or work with Israel.
I come back to the Human Rights Council, another arm or adjunct, and this is the only permanent agenda item of the Human Rights Council, agenda item number 7. It's permanent. You don't have to decide what you want to talk about. It keeps coming up. Is aimed at targeting Israel. How do you, and one other thing, there's now a new inquiry. There's been a lot of special rapporteurs. Goldstone, a famous one in 2009, South Africa, after Operation Cast Lead, who said that Israelis were targeting civilians. Of course, then withdrew those comments and regretted saying them. There's a new commission investigating May, and the countries that sit on this commission. I think we've got a slide of them, but there's a new commission. So there they are. If you can see those, I can't read them, but well-known human rights champions like China and Cuba and Libya, champions of human rights. Pakistan, we know them. That's who's running the show. And you have someone who's been appointed to chair the Commission of Inquiry called Navi Pillay, who is a South African justice who has a history, is a contributor to the Durban Conference, and has before called Israel apartheid, and in July of 2014 was the subject of a U.S. congressional public letter, it's the year before you got to the UN, signed by 100 members saying that the Human Rights Council cannot be taken seriously as a human rights organization over its handling over the 2014 Israeli-Gaza conflict. And this is Hillel Neuer saying that she's not a credible person heading up this council. So here we are, and there will be an investigation. We all can write this. We all can write it now. We don't have before the investigation starts. What does Israel do, or what can it do? This is just more fodder. We've seen this with Human Rights Watch, another organization, with Amnesty International recently calling Israel an apartheid state. And this becomes fodder for social media. And I understand your point, and I think everybody watching today understands that it is more important to have secure borders on the ground to any existential threat than it is to have good PR. Everybody gets that. On the other hand, trying to do better on the PR front's not a bad idea too. So we can not multitask completely, but how do we do better on that front? And how do we do better at the UN on the communications perception and a whole young generation? All this history we have, people don't know it. And we always speak that one of the best tools we have in our arsenal is knowledge, because the history is on our side. The indigeneity of the Jewish people in the land of Israel is on our side. But how do we communicate this? How do we do a better job of communications?
First, Jonathan, I think our goal is to win all fronts. And usually when we engage in any kind of a conflict, we have 3 fronts to deal with. The first and most important is the military front. We have to win the war on the ground, period. That's the most important thing. And I told my colleague in the IDF, you do what you have to do, and I will defend you when we have to defend you in the international media or at the UN stage. The second front is the diplomatic front. We need to get the support of the diplomatic community. And by the way, last May, we received the support. People understood what we were doing and why we were actually protecting. The third front, which we were not successful last May, is what you mentioned, the social media and the media front. And I think we have to do a better job. We have to react much faster. And I would add the argument with the military that we need the information fast. in today's world, we cannot release the footage of what happened in the Marmara when the vessel came into Israel a day later. By the time we released the information, it was over. Same when we look at May, when we had the issue of the building where you had the AP office in Gaza. I knew why we chose to attack this location and we evacuated the building. But by the time we actually released the data and the information, it was too late. So I think we have to be more aware of that, mainly the military, that we have to be faster and provide the information as part of the operation and not a day or a week later. And I think also we have to realize that we need to mobilize organizations like Honest Reporting and individuals that are there to support Israel. We have millions of people that stand with us. We always speak about our adversaries, but I learned at the UN that we also have friends. And we need to reach out to them, to mobilize them, to give them the ammunition to act. And it's an ongoing. It will never happen that we will say, that's it, we won the war. We convinced the world about why we are doing what we can do to protect ourselves and to minimize casualties. It will never happen. Being a Zionist, I always say it's a marathon. You have to wake up in the morning and you have to preach your ideology, and you have to do it every morning. And that's why I think we have to understand it. And I think that we also, as the government of Israel, we need to invest more funds, not only money, but also technology and the minds into doing a better PR for Israel. And I saw the difference when I was in the Ministry of Defense. When we needed the budget for something in the Ministry of Defense, we got it within 24 hours. When I was serving as the ambassador at the UN and we requested a budget for anything we wanted, we never got any budget. And it's important. Yes, it's important to buy aircraft and tanks, but it's also important to win the war on social media.
We have a few questions that have come in, but before and we only have time for maybe one, maybe a second, but you've talked about a couple of high water marks at the UN for yourself. What was a bad day? What was a really bad day for you at the UN?
Well, a bad day was when I learned that there were more reports coming against us and lies being spread. And you had to go and work with the bureaucrats of the UN. So people always think about the ambassador that you speak with other countries. But most of the work of the Israeli ambassador to the UN is to work with the UN itself, with all the agencies of the UN, with all the bureaucracy of the UN, and to push back against reports, against resolutions. So, in one hand, you build friends and you have the colleagues from different countries, but at the same time, you have to work against the machine of the UN, which is unfortunately concerned in promoting anti-Israel agenda.
I'm going to ask you, we have time for one question that's come in. There's a few very good ones in the world of geopolitics. It deals with China, which of course we haven't touched on so many things. I wish we had much more time, but it says, in recent months, the news media has covered stories of the United States pressuring Israel with varied levels of success to scuttle deals related to China. But as the world's fastest growing and maybe soon to be largest economy, how can Israel balance its ties to its long-standing patron and the American opponent in Asia?
So that's a very important topic. And also when I served as Deputy Minister of Defense, we dealt with that issue a lot. Israel is a startup nation. We attract a lot of investments and we are proud of it. We cannot block investments from different countries, but we have to respect our allies. And if the US, if our friends have concerns on specific issues, mainly military and defense related, my personal position is that we should think how can we respect it and work with them. On the other end, you cannot block investors from coming and invest on Israeli companies, period. So you have to draw the line where you find the sensitivity for sensitive issues, but at the same time, we can and should allow every country that we have diplomatic relations to come and invest in Israel.
Last question, my question. What's next for Ambassador Danny Danon?
Well, as you can see, I'm very passionate about the fascinating issues we discussed, and I learned a lot at the UN. I have more skills and connections, and I intend to use those skills and connections for the people of Israel. So I cannot tell you any specific position, but for sure I intend to be involved in public life in Israel.
Well, Ambassador, we know whatever direction it takes, it'll be for the good of Israel, and it'll be well done with passion, with conviction, with intelligence, and with a sense for, and in a human way, I would say. So I'd like to thank you immensely for taking this time. We know you're busy, and illuminating part of the story of Israel and the UN. It's a great story. Maybe it's another book. I don't know. We look forward to reading this book. I'm going to ask to see this book one more time because it's a fascinating topic. Daniel was 80 when he went in the lion's den, so you're a young Daniel. But it also it goes back to Nebuchadnezzar and 600 BCE, 2,600 years ago, and that's how long we've been telling stories about the Jewish people in Israel. So it's I'm happy you chose that name. I look forward to reading the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank all our viewers. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.